Hello, everyone. So welcome back. Dr. Hawk and I want to talk about the Crusades. We want to talk about not just the dates and the exactly what took place during the period of the Crusades in the medieval period, but also what were the Christian-Muslim relations like during that time? What were the lasting legacies of that? Why is it continued to be problematic to this day? So we want to dive into that a little bit today. And first, we want to hear from Dr. Hawk as he talks to us about that period. Dr. Hawk?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ott, and hello, students. I hope you are enjoying the semester and going through the historical background of the Christian-Muslim relations. Well, when we talk about Christian-Muslim relations, Crusades become more important because Crusades are pretty much have become a symbol of Christian-Muslim relations. And this is unfortunate that it's not a positive symbol, but it has become a symbol which has become like always important whenever Christian-Muslim relations are being considered or discussed. The Crusades must be there. So we will talk. I will specifically talk about that how Crusades affected the Christian-Muslim relations. And then Dr. Ott will mention it that after the Crusades, what were the impact that, and of course, these impact continues and these can be sometimes felt even today. So to start with, it was the end of the 11th century that the Crusades took place. And it was basically the West came out all the way to the Near East, and they wanted to go to Jerusalem, which was controlled or ruled over by the Muslims at that time. And it was a long way from the Western Christians to march, and they have to go through the Constantinople, which is the Turkey today, to get to the Jerusalem. And there are a lot of things that we need to really note and highlight during all this. But at the end of the day, the Crusades was not really helpful for the Christianity or for the Christendom the way it was supposed to be. But it left rather more like negative impact. First of all, that it became a symbol of Christian-Muslim relations, which was not a positive one. And then the Pope actually behind the whole movement, who actually motivated the whole Western Christians or the European Christians, his name was Pope Urban. And basically what he presented to the Western Christians was that let's go and liberate the Jerusalem from the Muslims. And that was his line that he worked around, and he motivated everybody in the European Christianity, and they started marching towards that. Now, when he was motivating Christians, he mentioned Muslims in a negative way. And this negativity about the Muslims became the reason for the Crusades, that they march. And this was something that had an impact in the Christian mind or in the Western mind about the Muslims. And on the other hand, Muslims were not aware that there was a religious war being waged on them. And they, according to Carabel, even after the Jerusalem was taken over by the Crusades after the first Crusade, Muslims still did not realize that it was really a joint effort by the European Christians against Islam. They were just taking it as another military challenge that they have been facing before. But the time in which the Crusades marched towards the Near East or the Muslim world, it was a lucky time for Crusaders for several reasons. One, because Muslims were not united at that time. They were divided into different states, different power centers, and there were some mutual wars were going on, particularly between Seljuks, Turks, and Fatimids. Fatimids was a Shia power based in Egypt, in North Africa, and they were against Turks and Seljuks. So the Muslims were kind of divided and weak, and it was probably the right time that the Crusades marched in. If it had been any time before that, it would have been difficult for them when the Muslims were united and together. Now, before they came here, some of the things that Pope Urban used to motivate the European Christians and to move them, because it was not an easy journey, it was a very long march all the way from France, Italy, Germany, other places to Jerusalem, particularly in those days. So if you look at the speech of the Pope Urban, which basically became the motivational speech, he used a lot of negative things about Muslims, and the idea was not actually to present the true Muslim picture, but the idea was to motivate and prepare the European Christians. So I was noting the few points in his speech that, first of all, he presented Muslims as an evil force, and that it is a religious duty of the Christians to stand up and fight against them. Then he tried to take their sympathy by saying that Muslims are torturing and giving hard time to the pious and the righteous Christians in Jerusalem. And so it is our duty to stand up for the sake of God, go and save them. And then he used the Jerusalem itself, its sanctity, its sacredness, its holy place where the Christ's blood fallen, and where the birthplace of the Christ, and all these he used to motivate the European Christians so that they get ready. And in doing that, he of course, he presented a picture in which that the Muslims are using it for taking over the Jerusalem, and we have to liberate it. Now, also for the motivational next point that he has was that he promised with the kings and the princes and everybody a big reward and the forgiveness of their sins if they will go and march to liberate the Jerusalem. So this was something in the Crusades which is related with our topic, which is Christian-Muslim relations. And unfortunately, this was something, the purpose was not really the Muslims, the purpose was to motivate the Christians, but unfortunately, the Muslim rule over the Jerusalem was used like that. And many Christians, European Christians, by this speech, they thought that Muslims have recently taken over the Jerusalem. Well, as a matter of fact, Jerusalem was under the Muslims for the last 400 years. And during that time, Christian pilgrims have been going, visiting, and they were not stopped. Everybody was free, Jews, Christian, Muslims, to go there. Now, misunderstandings that developed from this, for example, he used the word for Muslims as demon worshippers, infidels, barbarians, godless monsters. These were the words that really affected the European mind about the Muslims. And you can imagine that if this kind of mindset will be developed, then it will have a long-term effect on that. Now, basically, what, according to our textbook by Carabel, the reason for this whole exercise was more related with the European and less with the Jerusalem by itself. So, for example, Carabel explains that he says that Europe was being torn into pieces there was anarchy, chaos, and a lot of kings were fighting with each other, and the church influence was losing big time. So, in order to increase the prestige and the influence of the church, Pope Urban thought that let me get them together so they forget their mutual fights and they come all together under the church, and we lead them to Jerusalem, and this will uh, help in taking care of this anarchy or the chaos which is going on in the Europe. Well, that was a good idea because it really helped. They forgot their mutual fights, their differences. They all got together. They became good Christians. They became under the church again. The church influence increased. So at least in the first crusade, this happened. But later on, things were different. So that was basically the reason, and this is how what happened. Now, Christians, European Christians, when they were moving towards Jerusalem, they have to pass water and other places, and they did not have a naval fleet at that time. So they came through the Constantinople, and from there they marched. Now, as far as the Muslim situation is concerned, I just want to mention here briefly that Seljuk Turks were struggling with the Byzantines, and their Seljuk Turks and Fatimids. Fatimids was the Shia dynasty of the North Africa, and the Shia Sunni problem was there. So there was a lot of fights going on in between the Muslims. Besides that, from Constantinople to Jerusalem, the cities that were on their way or the surrounding cities of the Jerusalem were all actually ruled by independent rulers. There was no united army. So it was easy to take those cities one by one. And since those cities were in mutual rivalry, no city came to help the other city. So this is how the Crusades kept on taking one city by one city and moving towards the Jerusalem. Muslim world overall was unaware. Like Christianity was full of the spirit of unity, religion, and moving against Islam, but Muslims were not having this kind of united spirit that we should get together to fight against Christians. According to Carabel's our textbook, Muslims never rallied together to unite their forces to fight against Christians, not before the Jerusalem was taken over, not after the Jerusalem was taken over. And according to Carabel, when after 100 years, when Saladin came and he took the Jerusalem back, he did not took it back because Muslims all united against with him. No, Muslims were still busy in their own things. But the reason Saladin was successful because of his own military tactics, and not because he has support of the whole Muslim world behind him. So that was basically the reason, and this is what was the impact that was having. As far as Muslims are concerned, they were scattered, disunited, and that was. But in spite of this, Saladin personally, he was a very smart military general, and he has good tactics, good plans. So in 1187, he was able to take the Jerusalem back. Now, when the first time when the Crusaders took over the Jerusalem in 1099, unfortunately, before them in Jerusalem, there were three kinds of people: Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Now, the Christians thought that Christians are coming from European area, they want to pilgrimage, and they want to visit and all that, so they welcomed them. But unfortunately, Crusaders have been coming a long way, and probably they were so tired and so frustrated. When they took over the Jerusalem, they created a very horrible scene. And Karabal mentions it on page 101, and I'm going to read a few lines from him. He says that under the first Crusades, when the Jerusalem was taken over, the soldiers swept through the city and killed every single soul they found. The massacre was not limited to Arabs and Turkish Muslims. The Jews of the city took refuge in their synagogue only to be locked inside and burned alive. Eastern Orthodox monks tried to keep the shrine of the holy spooker from being looted by soldiers who were more interested in the booty than in the blessings. But they were cut down where they stood. There were stories of infants dashed against stones of torture and lasted for days to amuse the troops. The beheadings of the impalings, flayings, dismemberments, and corpses everywhere. And now that, and then neat piles of heads surrounded. Well, the bottom line is that those Christians living in Jerusalem, they also became target of the Crusaders. And unfortunately, this did not ended up the way it was supposed to be, the way it was coming down, because, and the reason behind this was that the soldiers practically went out of the control of their generals and their leaders in the Jerusalem. And many leaders, crusade leaders, tried to stop them, but it was such a chaos that they could not hold them. This Jerusalem remained under the Crusades for about 100 years. And then after 100 years, when the Saladin took it back again and became under the rule of the Muslims, and then it continued like that until the end of the Second World War and the end of the Ottoman Empire. And with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, I think that was when the Jerusalem went back in the control of the Jews. So that has been briefly the history and the Crusades and the impact of that. But those impacts were not limited that time. They went down in the history, and about which Dr. Ott will talk about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hawk. What I want to talk about is some of the effect and legacies of the Crusades. The lasting impact that not only that it had at the time, specifically in the immediate history, but also even in the modern day. What makes the Crusades so problematic? I mean, there have always been wars and warring factions and warring states, but the Crusades remains in kind of the psyche of both East and West as problematic and something with which we have to wrestle. And for many people, there would oftentimes there can be the reaction of, why do we have to obsess about wars that took place 1,000 years ago? Aren't we past that now? The truth is that what made the Crusades so unique is the manner in which they were attached to religious motivation, and in a way that historians debate exactly how pure were those religious motives. But nevertheless, because of how those come together and the way that language remains as part of the religious lexicon, it still remains somewhat problematic. I mean, for us here in the West, we have to think about sometimes the ways in which the people in the Middle East look at the Crusades, and when they hear us use that language, what's their reaction? So we want to talk a little bit about some of those lasting effects. First of all, on Blackboard, I'm going to be sharing a handout that is on Blackboard that for you to use and review. That I put on here, effects and legacy of the Crusades. Just a little bit of review, some of the basic facts that Dr. Hawk covered. The first crusade, in 1095, Pope Urban preached the crusade at Clermont in France to aid Alexius I, Emperor of Byzantium, which quickly took on religious overtone to reclaim sacred lands. And when we talk about some of the rhetoric that he used in describing Muslims in the Middle East, one, he's talking as though that conquest of Jerusalem has somehow been recent, when in reality it had been under Muslim rule, like Dr. Hawk said, for quite some time. And with Christians being able to go on pilgrimages and being able to visit the city, sometimes with a fee, but nevertheless having freedom to go there and to visit Jerusalem and be part of their religious pilgrimage. So that was an exaggeration, that was hyperbole. But some of the rhetoric that Pope Urban used to describe these, godless demoniacs, I put that in quotes, that were supposedly controlling the Holy Land at the time. What that invoked was that would have been similar imagery to many of the natural religions that medieval Christians would have encountered in Europe at the time. Some of the Celtic religions and some of the European natural religions they may have found, they would have considered to be just demonic worship, earth worshiping, demon worshiping people at the time. And that's where you get later on the many of the New England issues about witchcraft have their origins in the natural religions of Northern Europe. Well, people who would have heard Pope Urban's speech would have seen that and projected that upon what a far distant people that they have never encountered before. And that's what conjured in their mind, the type of people that they felt like they needed to liberate the Holy Land from. Well, and the reason why that this idea of liberating the Holy Land is because all religions have this idea of sacred space. And sacred space can be architectural, it can be environmental, it can be geographical. And so when people are devout Christians, or any devoutly religious people of any type, will typically have a holy land of some kind where they're going to, they see it as part of their devotion to visit that space and to be able to experience the spirituality related to that space that's somehow more potent than the spirituality that they have the rest of the time. If you're a Muslim, there's that pilgrimage to Mecca. If you're Christian, there can be a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. If you're Hindu, there can be a visit to India. And so all these different religions have a way of this idea of almost being a homeland of the faith. Well, for medieval Christians, the pilgrimages to the Holy Land would have been something that there would be a pilgrimage road that they could take. And as a result, this conjures up religious overtones of trying to defend the Holy Land from godless pagans that they in their mind they might have encountered even in Europe. So this idea of taking the Holy Land really has this religious zeal attached to it. And like Dr. Hawk said, nothing unites people like war. So if the princes of Europe are infighting and they're warring between themselves, well, a war that's going to somehow unify them to go and retake the Holy Land or reclaim it for Christendom, that's going to increase the church's influence also. So the First Crusade sets out from Europe 5 armies of between 50 and 60,000 soldiers. It crosses Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey, in 1097. It captures Antioch, in Syria in 1098, and conquers Jerusalem in 1099. And with the exception of the city governor and some dignitaries, the entire civilian Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were massacred. Now, this type of, as both Goddard and Carable describe it, this type of massacre in Jerusalem would have taken on just a frenzy, an orgy of violence, if you will, that would have been that would have left its mark in the collective psyche of the entire Middle East at the time. And so, this is where the idea of the pious soldier that's doing his work for Christ really starts to break down. Whatever may have been the motivation for soldiers to go on this crusade, the idea of the pious crusader that somehow is doing his work for Christ really breaks down then. And when we look at how the massacre of Jerusalem during the First Crusade. So the First Crusade ended with tragedy, and tragedy that not only was left, it remained in the collective psyche of the Middle East, and that being the impression of the Crusades from the Eastern perspective from then on. But it also really, again, called into question the supposed purity of the Crusader motive. Is this truly a holy enterprise? Now, the Catholic Church has since responded to, much of our work comes, and Goddard and Carabel relies heavily on the work of the historian, is it Stephen Ruhnkemann, in his description of the Crusades, and the Catholic Church has responded to that by suggesting that somehow it was a limited view and what isn't giving the full picture. But nevertheless, there's enough alternate sources to that can describe the ending of the First Crusade to render the Crusade problematic, no matter from what historical angle that's describing it. Now, Bernard of Clairvaux later on preaches a second crusade in 1146 at Burgundy, after it had fallen, after the second crusade, after Jerusalem had fallen back into Muslim control. But that second crusade failed when the combined French and German armies were defeated at Damascus. Now Bernard of Clairvaux, the reason why I mentioned that is because Bernard of Clairvaux has been actually cited a great deal as one of the early church fathers, and being a theologian of the medieval period, that is someone who speaks a great deal about the love of Christ and compassion on others. And yet, for some reason, it's therefore problematic that Bernard would also preach for a second crusade in light of all this, what was happening at the time. So that makes church history always a mixed picture. That in many cases, some of the same authors that we see preaching about the love of Christ and the compassion of the church also may have been someone who promoted the activities of the church at the time, the Roman church, even when they're engaged in something like this, the Crusades. So another lasting aspect of the Crusade is that some of our beloved church historians and church theologians, like Bernard of Clairvaux, have to be you have to pick through their writings and kind of remember that they're a mixed bag there. The Third Crusade, led by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, that was able to get all the way to Jerusalem, but Richard never entered the city. Instead, he negotiated a peace treaty with Saladin to reestablish the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but left the city in Muslim control. And just to kind of put that in its historic perspective, many of you may have watched films related to the medieval period, specifically as it relates to the mythical character of Robin Hood. Well, typically that invokes Richard the Lionheart at that time. And so these Crusades, just kind of attaching this to popular media, that's typically the historic period when a lot of those romanticized tellings of medieval history, this is the period that they're typically referencing. But what also makes the Crusades problematic is when you look at the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade was waged primarily at Constantinople, as the Roman Church attempted to bring the Byzantine Church under their control. Now, in this case, this makes us look at the Crusades as something possibly, yes, for some, maybe the First Crusade and maybe later, it may have been a way for the pious to have something to do, a way to exercise their faith. But by the time you get to the Fourth Crusade, really mercenaries are out for booty. And when they are trying to gain treasure, these military expeditions are a way to advance themselves, to make themselves rich. And when Rome would not pay the Venetian mercenaries, they sacked Constantinople. And I've attached in the content section a video that I found helpful from YouTube that basically describes this in this episode more in detail. But a lot of this has more to do with the rivalry between the East and West Christianity than it does between Christianity and the Muslim world. And the Fourth Crusade kind of revealed that. By the time you get to the final Crusades between 1208 and 1271, these are a series of failed military expeditions aimed more at perceived enemies of Christendom than at Muslim states. So some of those are leading against pagans within modern Yugoslavia and in the Macedonian peninsula, or and in other areas where but finally culminating in Emperor Frederick in 1229 negotiating a short-lived transfer of Jerusalem to Crusader control, but it was short-lived. It quickly went back, within a decade, it went back to Muslim control. So this is, the era of the Crusades ends with finally the Western Christian world basically giving up, realizing this is not gaining us what we thought. But there were some lasting impacts of this, and these are 6 legacies that are summarized of the Crusades, summarized from the Goddard material. One, among Muslims, the Crusades left a lasting mistrust of Western Christians. In the Western world, we tend to have very short attention spans, and we tend to think historically of what happened last week, not the last millennium, or not the last 100 years. I mean, oftentimes, in our fast-paced culture, we don't think about grudges that may have been decades or even centuries old. But nevertheless, if the interaction of East and West is such that from out of nowhere, the Muslim world experiences something like the First Crusade, that leaves a lasting distrust with Western Christians. Even among Eastern Christians, there's a concern over Western Christians and the West, the Western Hemisphere, and if it's whether it can be trusted, whether it's plagued with treachery and ambition, and that tends to even have an effect even in geopolitics even to this day. If you watch the news related to East versus West, what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, Europe, things like this, even now, these things tend to still have an East versus West side of it, even in between countries that both of which will claim Christian heritage. Now, another effect is they help to provoke the revival of Muslim expansion. Following this, following the era of the Crusades, you later on see more expeditionary movements from Muslim-controlled countries northward. You see later on, centuries later, you see the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which allows people to see, which enables them to Muslim countries to expand their territories and be able to shore up that region. Let me just stop sharing for a moment because my things are popping up on my screen. Let me continue just for a moment. There we go. Now, another legacy is it produced among Muslims a greater emphasis on Jerusalem as the third holy place of Islam. One of the assertions from Goddard is that prior to this, it had been primarily Mecca and Medina, and now Jerusalem is now an area which winds up being a symbol of security, a place, especially the Dome of the Rock there in Jerusalem, where it is a place where Muslims can congregate and a pilgrimage to the site, and becomes a holy place to that area, emphasized far more after the Crusades than beforehand. Now, it contributed to worsening the position of Christians under Muslim rule. Now, we spoke about this before, that prior to this, Christians had lived in areas that were under Muslim rule with relative peace, and there was a great deal of tolerance. In some cases, there was a slight tax that we've covered in another lecture, but it was certainly not anything that we would consider to be oppressive. But this worsened position of Christians under Muslim rule, especially when now they possibly could be considered to be a subversive force within Muslim society. So now it has neighbor against neighbor, or Muslim rulers looking at Christians communities as a possible usurping agent within their community. Expanding the involvement of the Western Roman Catholic Church in the Middle East. Later on, you'll see the Roman Church asserting authority with areas such as Antioch, or outside of Jerusalem, asserting its control in areas what normally would have been primarily Eastern Christian concerns. And it contributed to the development of what can be by some considered to be a positive effect, is it contributed to the development of contacts on different levels between the Muslim world and Western Europe, paving the way for the Renaissance. Now, not only this created exchanges of ideas, exchanges of materials, but because of all the armies that marched through Europe and find their way down to the Levant or modern-day Palestine, you had a lot of roads that were developed and larger major thoroughfares and trade routes that occurred out of this that actually expanded exchanges between the West and the Muslim world. So there are some positive effects you can possibly see that came out of the Crusades, but mostly it's an area of history that is problematic and difficult that has to be dealt with and can't be swept under the rug. Now, as long as it's dealt with honestly, people can maintain dialogue and acknowledge this lesson from history, that it's something that has to be, something that has to be talked through and conversed about, so that people understand the lasting legacy here. Now, in many ways, Carabel asserts that the Crusades did more to harm the Eastern Byzantine Empire than it did any Muslim states of the Near East. And some historians might even argue that was the point, because since the Great Schism of 1094, which also in your content section is a video about the Great Schism there, between East and West Christianity. Ever since the Great Schism of 1094, some historians argue that Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, or the Christianity of the West, has sought to somehow reclaim what had been lost, both the power and the power and the position and the wealth of the East, and try to make Christianity one church again. And so, in many respects, especially in the Fourth Crusade and how the Western Crusaders marched through Byzantium down to get into the Levant, even if they got that far, there's this assertion that the Crusades were the Muslim threat was a way to basically rally the troops. But the point of sending the troops was you're going to be marching through Byzantium and you're going to be westernizing, and the Western Church is going to be influencing and leaving garrisons and leaving resources and rulers along the way. And so some argue that the point of the Crusades was actually more meant to attack the Eastern Byzantine Empire and the Church of the East and try to unify it with the West again. That certainly seemed to have been the result. And when you have a result like that, historically, there's a legitimate side where people argue if that whatever the result was, we might be able to argue that was the goal. Now, fast forward a couple centuries. One of the lasting legacies of the Crusades is how they're viewed by both sides. The East views the Crusades as largely a negative, except for maybe the context that are created in trade and cultural exchange that happened between the Near East and Europe. Aside from that, largely they sees it as largely negative. In the West, over time, the Crusades became mythologized as, in many cases, being, where mythological tales of knights that are going on their holy quest that winds up becoming part of the mythology of the West. So as a result, the Crusader in the East is, an invader that's going to basically sack the town and kill everyone in sight. The Crusader, that's from the Eastern perspective. The Crusader from the Western perspective is possibly a pious warrior who is wearing shiny armor and going to be doing his service for God, motivated by some sort of religious zeal. Well, that's problematic. So, depending on who you're talking to, and what does Crusades mean? Well, in the American Christian tradition, in many ways to expand Christianity, as oftentimes used, especially in the late 19th and early in the 20th centuries, many of the great pushes to expand Christianity through evangelism and evangelization of people have used the term Crusades as their the label for their movements. One of the great American preachers, a Christian preacher by the name of Billy Graham, who would hold stadiums, large stadiums full of people to come hear him speak, both throughout the 20th century, from the mid 20th century up until the latter half, but basically from 1940s up and throughout the latter half of the 20th century, would hold these large stadium events in which the attempt was to persuade people to convert to Christianity, and they were all called Crusades. And as a result, the Christians all thought that this was fine because you're going to have a crusade to expand Christianity. But pretty much they're the only ones who thought that. Anyone outside of the Christian arena would see someone, might see someone using the term crusades, especially if it's going to, preachers like Billy Graham or other evangelical evangelists like Luis Palau to Central America, or others that went to Africa, would hold large stadium crusades and be completely baffled why that would be considered a negative term or a negative connotation, or wonder why it is they weren't received well when they showed up and say, we're going to hold a crusade in your town. So that's part of why many in evangelical and many in the American Christian tradition were baffled as to why someone would react to the crusade term like that. And to even make it a little bit more recent, within the last 10 years, certain schools, colleges, and high schools throughout the country have begun to drop the term Crusader as their school mascot. Why? You can read about this online related to high schools and colleges, going back to 2016 or even just in the last 10 years. Why is that historically religious schools, colleges, and high schools who have had the term Crusader have begun to drop that and adopt other mascots? And of course, people react to that saying, well, why are you kowtowing to very sensitive people? Why can't you just keep things as they are? I don't like change. And so I don't want you to lose that time-honored mascot that we have, the Crusader, because they have only a positive view of that. And those schools stop and say, well, hold on a second. This is historically problematic. Even if we go beyond just the recounting of the Crusades from Stephen, I'm trying to remember the author's name, Stephen Runciman, that Goddard cites. Even if we go just beyond that, the recounting of the Crusades, it's still a problematic term. And the world we live in now, because of global interactions and because of the internet and because of the diversity of people that we have as a student body or the communities we're in, this is the idea of a Crusader isn't as pure a mascot, isn't as pure a symbol as we once thought it was. So history has taught us better, and with the world that we live in now has to make us more mindful of those around us. And so that's the idea of the Crusades being something problematic that we have to navigate around, continues even to this day. So, and I'll finish with this. I grew up in a Christian tradition that would be considered evangelical fundamentalist, and we sang many songs and hymns in churches a lot. And one of the most famous hymns that's sung in many different Christian contexts, in a lot of churches in the U.S. Sing this song, is a song called "Onward, Christian Soldiers." It's a very popular hymn. Its tune is known widely throughout American Christianity. Just about everybody who's raised in a Christian context can practically recite it and hum it for you. But the lyrics go like this: "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. Christ, the royal master, leads against the foe. Forward into battle, see his banners go." And the chorus is, "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before." Well, the rest of the verses basically maintain that tone. And the song was written by an Anglican priest in the 19th century to describe as part of the Christian school for students that would be processing from one part of the school into church that is meant to be part of their procession going into school. But the simple fact is that it caught on, and it wound up being something that is for any Christian organization that really wants to be militant and wants to be influential in their culture. They wind up using this idea of the Christian soldier as an analogy, as something of being as something of as a metaphor for the efforts that they're going to engage in to try to Christianize the world through persuasion, not necessarily through arms, but through persuasion. But nevertheless, using this rhetoric here, regardless of how much you may find, regardless of how someone may have the intent of, say, Peter the Venerable, described in the book of, in our Goddard book, someone who primarily wants to Christianize people through persuasion and logic and rhetoric, regardless of whether or not, whatever their motive may be, using language like this in hymns sung, very widely in Christianity to this day, continues to have overtones to the Crusades that, quite frankly, all of us have to look at and honestly say that's not as pure a historic inspiration as we would like it to be. And so that's part of that legacy of the Crusades that we have to wrestle with and discuss. So as Dr. Hawk was discussing the Crusades, I put in this handout a map for you to kind of show where all these armies came from and where they are, where all the major battles are taking place here, including the kingdoms established by the Crusaders at the time. But that's for your benefit. You can see where all these Crusades take place. But basically, what I want to do is share with you those legacies and those effects of the Crusades and how they're not just history. They're not just something in the ancient past. They're continuing to be a topic with which we have to wrestle and with which we have to maintain honest and sincere dialogue if we're going to have any semblance of appropriate or productive interfaith dialogue or Christian Muslims to this day. So, thank you. Dr. Hawk?
Yes, thank you so much. That was very enlightening. So I hope the students will understand and they will follow it.
I'll go ahead and stop recording at this time.